Hi everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It will be my pleasure to present to you my policy brief on how can environmental regulation pave the way for eco-innovation. Now, but also I think this is a timely question because we are in the wake of political turmoil with the Brexits and Trumps and so on, but we are also dreading the results of future elections in France, in Italy, in the Netherlands. And what is important here is that we wouldn't lose the acquis accumulated during several decades because of the action of individuals. In economics, this is known as the Porter hypothesis, the so-called win-win situation where environmental regulation can achieve competitiveness but also reduce environmental harm. And we've seen many times during the lectures of the program the so-called idea of reconciliating between the economic aspect, the social aspect and the environmental aspect, how controversial that was as well during our discussions. And the idea here claimed by Porter is that well-designed environmental regulation, whatever that means, and this is also one of the points we will try to tackle in this policy brief, could achieve this win-win situation. However, so far we can only acknowledge the failure of the regulators in pushing the eco-innovation machine. So what Porter has intended in his original idea is that environmental regulation will foster eco-innovation at the firm level. This eco-innovation could allow to improve business competitiveness, but also reduce environmental harm. So what does the scientific evidence tell us about this relationship? Well, if you look at the literature, if you look at the scientific literature, you find that this typical dichotomy between command and control and market-based instruments. But what we try to emphasize here in this policy brief is the perception of environmental regulation by businesses. And this has been shown in a paper published in Research Policy in 2012, where we look at the initiating factors of eco-innovation. And if we try to split them differently, we can see that incentives are just as or even more important than legally binding instruments as an initiating factor for eco-innovation. Now, another remark here is that internal drivers are certainly not enough for driving eco-innovation, and this justifies the regulatory intervention. But what are the policy alternatives? We hear a lot about policy mixes, hybrid regulation, and this will create synergies. However, research also warns us about the possible redundancies when using multiple policy instruments to achieve the same goal. So what we try to do in this table is assess the political adequacy of each policy instruments. We have a list of policy instruments in achieving their policy objective. And in the policy objectives, we have limited ourselves to 4 long-term targets. We think this is important. The regulatory stability for businesses, stringency of the policy instrument, as well as the potential synergies. And as you can see, command and control instruments fail in achieving these long-term targets because you set a standard, businesses will only try to comply with the standard, but there is no incentive to go further. And lack the synergies you have with other instruments. However, they provide a relative stable regulatory framework, and they have all the stringent power. The other instruments, such as market-based information instruments and so on, would lack this stringency and regulatory stability, but make up for it in terms of long-term objectives and the potential synergies. Now, what recommendations can we draw based on these facts? Well, first of all, if you focus on mixing the right instruments, you could have synergies. If you mix information-based instruments with self-regulation, for instance, you would create awareness, social awareness. On the one hand, awareness on the consumer, but also awareness within the industry. And this awareness would create a pressure, consumer pressure, but also peer pressure for businesses. The next point is mixing supply push with demand pull instrument. This is relatively well known in economics, but the idea is to incentivize businesses to invest in research and development technologies, creating a supply of eco-innovations, but also creating a market, on the other hand, by using eco-labels, for instance. Now, this will result in combining sticks and carrots. And combining the sticks with the carrots will allow us to have more radical eco-innovations rather than end-of-pipe eco-innovations, which will only reduce the environmental harm but do not reconcile all the different aspects we intend to. So another point that is important in this policy brief is to shift the focus from penalizing polluters, the polluter pay principles that we saw in the different lectures, to enabling eco-innovation. This is what we believe is the solution. So by doing this, we will shift the perception of environmental regulation from a cost burden to an opportunity also for businesses. And this is relatively important. We also need to acknowledge the heterogeneity of firms and avoid the one-size-fits-all. And we saw this in the context of countries during the sessions, but it's also the case for SMEs, because we have no lock-in technologies, we have no path dependencies, and this will allow us to have a higher absorptive capacity. And last point, but this is less of a recommendation and more of a reminder to tie it into the introduction, we need to focus on the intertemporal dimension of environmental regulation. Otherwise, we would lose this key to the action of individuals. And to work on this, we need to have ambitious objectives and do not refrain and revise them every time we have a crisis or so on. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed my presentation. I'm looking forward for your comments.